Hello again. Before I delve into the next part of the coverage of the case, I want to just reflect on some quite disturbing aspects. So the first would be at the end of the case when they Tyneside Council and Donna Grant put forward their plans for the future, which obviously included this long-term care order to emotionally cleanse a younger daughter and turn her into a cash generative asset for private equity. They used some quite dystopic terms. One was life story work. We will engage with life story work. So this was the summer of 2022. So nobody has ever contacted myself or my wife about her life prior to them taking her from us. Uh, Bearing in mind, part of that included this very proud Polish heritage. So, how can you engage in life story work with a child without engaging with the parents about their heritage and their experiences with her? Now, this is also interesting because earlier this year there was a care team meeting which I attended, and I was raising these issues about heritage. And social worker Deirdre Ryan um, said, I'm going to have to do some lifestyle, uh, like life history work with her, or whatever they call it. And then I put it to her, how are you going to do that without including the parents? How are you going to cover her Polish heritage for a start? How will you do that without? And she had no answer. And not surprisingly, I wasn't allowed to join further calls because you are challenging essentially cultural genocide. Um, and it essentially, this is really why we're in this position. We're standing up for corruption and racism, which is why I've been subject to police state terror. And actually, these very concerns were raised in statements I submitted myself as a litigant in person. And these were all dismissed by Rachel Hudson. So our concerns that I raised about this heritage being expunged have come to pass. And Rachel Hudson was well aware of these concerns and did nothing about them. In my mind, was complicit in what's happened. Um, and it kind of takes you to a dangerous reality we're in, where if somebody doesn't like a reality, they create a new one with distorted narrative, which is propped up by lies, essentially, and gross manipulation. You've seen it in action with the Labour government, um, and I saw it in action with the FCA in terms of when my interactions with them, when they eventually went on to threaten and try to coerce me, where I sort of said, you know, you can't understand these allegations without your own failures and how they were allowed to happen and awful weaknesses in the system. So in essence, that's a reality they don't want. So you create a new reality. So the new reality is, oh, you can't talk about this time zero that I covered in the book Lost to the Races. Um, you can't talk about, won't talk to you about our actions or inactions prior to when we intervened in April 2023. So you create a new reality. And that's why, in essence, I couldn't, and you've seen it with Theresa Chambers' statements, and so on and so on. You just invent a whole new reality. And that's why I couldn't engage with them in a legal process, which then led to these threats, you're not cooperating, and so on and so forth. You saw it with Duncan Alga's email, despite the fact me directing 3 witnesses to them that they didn't find, which is the most elementary level of investigator would have found. That was after the book was published. It's very disturbing. And also the other thing that I think is relevant to raise is this trial, this dreadful removal of trial by jury on the pretext that the system is over burdened, because the family courts are almost the portent for what can happen, because more and more things start moving just in front of a judge, possibly even behind closed doors, and not subject to any accountability at all. So the other angle to this is if you look at immigration, you look at Keir Starmer, for instance. When he said, I was making quite a lot of money as a lawyer at the time. What essentially he was doing was very similar to what happened in that we saw in the family court, where he'd learned how to formulate cases and put it in front of a probably ideologically aligned judge, and they pass through. And it's exactly the same in the family courts. You've got local authority in very incestuous legal circles, local authority legal professionals, their chums in the barrister circles and the judge, and they just know what they have to do, tick, 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 and the case rams through. And that is really where the trial without juries will take you if we're not careful. And you see also this build a convenient narrative around now with Ukraine, as I've covered. The reality is huge sums of money have gone to Ukraine. On a promise that they could win a war that realistically, as I've said, without NATO troops, are never going to be able to win, and maybe even struggle with NATO troops. Certainly without the US, against some country that got vastly superior resources and manpower. But all this money is being pumped in, and it's either been blown up by the Russians or stolen by, and parts as well, stolen by Ukrainian officials. And I raised this in the book, in the last chapter of the book, Lost to Races, where I said Zelensky will ultimately be seen very differently than what he was being presented at that time. Because it's taken, strangely enough, a long time for him to start removing staff very, very closely to him for corruption. And as I said, ultimately, Ukraine will end up in a worse position than it could have been had those peace talks that were sponsored by the Turks in 2020 had have been backed in earnest. But there's been an extraordinary loss of life and huge misallocations of money into a war that was based on a promise that had no substance. Victory for Ukraine, victory for Ukraine, victory for Ukraine. Remember all those things. Now they have to try to create a fake reality to cover that. And if you notice, whenever there's, it looks like there's progress being made in the peace talks, something happens, strange enough. Drones, which never really, that there was any evidence of substance backing that. It just didn't stand up to scrutiny. Ships that are coming to cut cables that aren't actually in British waters and technically doing anything illegal. Maybe they were there as a provocation, I don't know. You'd have to ask the Russians, but they weren't technically doing anything illegal. Then the Novichok coming out. All these things seem to be oddly timed to disturb a peace process to prevent the UK and the Europeans having to confront their own people and explain their actions in Ukraine and why they ever thought they were going to be able to win this conflict, and why those peace talks in 2022 were scuppered, when we could end up in a worse position from Ukraine's point of view, but with a huge amount of loss of lives, and from the Europeans and UK, and to a certain extent the US before Trump came, massive loss of money, significant sums of which could have actually been stolen. So, you know, but to try to get out of that, you have to create this new reality. And no, I don't condone the invasion. I understood the provocations the Russians faced, but for me, you try to avoid war at all costs because it's the innocent people that suffer. So that kind of gives you a flavour. So on to this parental review. There's a few of the things I'll cover before that. You know, they were there was a very, very odd Snapchat message that they were banding around that older daughter had sent to this boy who, now probably a young man, but I feel greatly sorry for what he had to go through. And they were trying to push this quite a lot, and it said something along the lines, "My parents want to murder me, but I don't think they will because they don't want to go to jail." Now, straight away we were able to say, well, this is very rum, isn't it? Because this is a girl who, even in the lockdown periods, was still going to school because she mother had a sort of exemption with key worker, so they were able to go to school. So I'm not sure you do that if you were wishing to perpetrate all this constant abuse. She was sleeping in a room, so she had pretty much 24/7 access to technology, which is very odd as well if you were wishing to do such harm or hold these ambitions. And in the room, there was a board with key numbers, emergency services, grandparents in Poland, and so on and so forth. So when we started hitting with that kind of, they didn't quite know what to do with that. The other one was they were trying to say that she was denied food and so on and so forth, and they weren't, strange enough, went down a food poverty route. Wasn't enough money for food, and I sort of went back and said, well, okay, why don't I just submit a credit check and you can see whether there's any stresses. They backed off from that and then tried to reformulate that as body shaming, but we'll come to this. And there was also the time when they were talking about, you know, police interviews, and you know, I was saying yes, yeah, that's really what we should do, because then we've got to, you know, I don't quite have as much faith in the police now as I did then, for reasons that you'll understand, but you know, and then they were getting very unsettled by that. They thought, well, you know, this is a bit odd that you know we expect someone to be kind of begging for mercy, but actually saying, please, yes, go ahead. And they had to concoct this narrative that they went back to this, or doesn't want parents going to jail. But you know, I went subsequently and asked twice Northumbria Police to actually do it anyway, because it was in the best interest of all. And then we found this correspondence between their solicitor and Paul Mahan, South Tyneside, who pretty much suggests that some of the evidence that you'd be relying on looks to have been prejudiced by the foster carer, who daughter subsequently left for, amongst other things, accused of being overbearing. So you can see the ridiculous nature of this. So you go into this parental assessment. So this is Donna Grant who's going to parentally assess us. So you've got somebody. So in the process, that the independence of foe, and I've covered that. It doesn't even stand up to scrutiny, not even by any stretch of the imagination. So then you've got to look at the reality. You've got to be assessed by someone who's incentivized to get a long-term care order of your children. So in essence, you are forced by, in this case, Rachel Hudson, to engage with somebody who has an agenda against you, is incentivized. The local authority, via long-term care orders, have recourse for variable finance they can draw down from government. Um, and you have to engage with somebody who's building a narrative against you. So if you open up, they'll distort and create the reality that they want. Hence, why I've covered the distortion of reality in this video. And if you don't, they'll say you don't cooperate. So the whole thing is rigged, and it's quite concerning. And that is, you know, I'll go through the analysis of this because they kept it quite a while before they published it, because they wanted to dovetail it in with other statements. They could see how it had been fixed. But I mean, you're looking at somebody who is with social workers. My impression is you're generally dealing with people who wouldn't get the remuneration they get in that position elsewhere, and decisions are made whether you continue with that or not, because there's a very, very high turnover of staff, particularly in the local authority here, South Tyneside Council. And it comes back to, what do I believe is right? What do I want to do to earn my money? And that explains a lot of who you come up against. You're looking at someone I remember actually talking about the stresses I'd had in the previous job about the FCA and things like that. How I'd had to put it to the FCA, and she was scribbling it down because she thought it was something bad she could use against me, but she didn't really understand it. I tried to put it in a context and say, well, have you ever heard of Robert Maxwell? And I was trying to go down the route of, what happened with the Mirror Group pension fund. And no, of course not. That hadn't popped up on the. So I was trying to think, well, what could I do that she might have seen on a casual news feed? And I said, "You ever learned of Ghislaine Maxwell?" Oh yeah. It's Ghislaine Maxwell, yeah. Just straight away. And I said, "Well, it's her father," and I explained it like that. That's the caliber of person you're dealing with, and I kind of made a suggestion to her before these sessions, because they were very random and and no real structure to them. And I said, well, why don't you send questions prior? Because if you want to go back a long time in my life, probably going to help if I know what information you want and I can think about it and make it. But they won't do that because they won't want to provide any audit for what you're doing. And the other thing she was talking about is a genogram, which are very contentious actually in how these are used. And I sort of said to her, "What were you using this genogram? Then what's the academic? What's the theoretical foundation of it? Yeah, what's your academic understanding of it? What this model you're using? What's the theoretical foundation of it?" Was kind of like what I got, and I never got an answer. Which I think, if you're using something, you probably should be fairly familiar with what you're using, the tool of what you're using, its weaknesses, where people believe its strengths are, where people believe its weaknesses. But there was none of that. It was a hit job, effectively. Go out there, do dirty work, come up with a review, and we'll continue with this emotional sterilization, and we're building this reverse engineered conclusion. On the so that's as far as I'll take it with the case. I'll take you further in terms of how she presented it and the other developments of the case in the next video. But in terms of the devices, I still haven't had a response from Northumbria Police. This Sergeant Brooke didn't call. He's been made aware that this retention of devices is causing immense anxiety and stress. That I'm having to work with the crisis team to help me through it. He knows that the risk not being able to complete financial transactions. It's having a big impact on other aspects of my life. He's aware that there's 3 devices not even owned by me. There's been shown evidence of that in the case of my wife's device. And essentially, as you see in the previous email where I posted in this court response, which was in April, and I was accused of reacting negatively to that response in April to them, and then I perpetrated these spray paint incidents in January and February. So it's undeniable that they've used a pretext of a fake vandalism accusation, or vandalism. I think there's two of them. Absolutely no evidence whatsoever. Never made a threat like that. No evidence I knew where she lived or even tried to find out. No evidence that I knew what car she drove or had any interest in it. So because they now know that they've been busted on this pretext, to then use it to take devices and to search my house for 2 hours, terrorizing my wife. They're now applying psychological abuse effectively to try to break down that way. And that is what the UK has become. And I've made this point before, when states start to run into difficulty, and I was always interested in looking at solidarity in Poland and things like that, and there are other instances. One thing you'll see is the police stop policing what people would recognise as serious crimes, such as nasty assaults, vandalism, burglary, and all that stuff. Real vandalism, that is, not backdated and formulated vandalism and time machine vandalism. And they focus on thought, speech, ideas. They start policing those. And that is a trend you'll always see. It's not new, but it is scary. And it's scary the amount of liberties that have been taken from people in the UK via machinations that never ever appear in manifestos. But that's the world we're in. So take care for now.